might recall last week we had talked about Jesus coming out of the wilderness. He was filled with the Spirit and had gone into Galilee. And there he had been for a while, and his reputation began to grow. And people began to hear about him as he went from synagogue to synagogue and met with different people, different times. And the synagogue were excited to have him because of the things that he said, the way that he read the scriptures, and his reputation began to precede him as he went through Galilee. Finally, he comes to his home church, you remember, we talked about that. And he either volunteers or is asked to read scripture from the prophet of Isaiah. So he takes the scroll and he unrolls it, and he reads these words. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And when he had finished this, he went and sat amongst them and said, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. That's where our scripture starts for today. The people were amazed at what they heard. And Luke reports this. He said, all spoke well of him and were amazed at his gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? They asked. You see, these are positive words. This is a positive response on their part. This is not new scripture to them. They've heard this before. But the way he reads this, and then his proclamation that that scripture is now being fulfilled, set these people in wonder and amazement that he would say such a thing. Jesus' words don't provoke anger, I don't think. I think they provoke wonder. I think that the listeners hear the gracious words. And I think that what they do, they compliment him by saying, isn't this Joseph's son? Listen to how he speaks. Listen to what he says. This is a teacher. He's one of us. He's come from here. He's special to us. And God has blessed us. They probably thought to themselves to have one of our own to read such a way and to proclaim the good news for today. You see, the people of Israel had always read the scriptures of that time as God's covenant for them. And for them alone. It was meant for them. God had made a covenant with them. They heard Jesus' declaration of fulfillment as a promise of special favor. They kept it to themselves. But today, Jesus is getting ready to teach them a new truth. Anytime you hear Jesus say, I truly tell you, listen up. It's a message, and it's important. And he's about to put a truth on them that they're not really going to like. They're not going to like it. And he uses the prophets Elijah and Elisha to convey this truth, to start with. See, these two prophets reached beyond the people of Israel to those that were considered outsiders, to those that were considered Gentiles, to those that were not in the community, that were set apart. During the drought, for instance, Elijah blessed the Gentile widow in Zarephath. She was not Jewish, but Jesus says that the prophet goes to her, and she receives a blessing. During an outbreak of leprosy, Elisha healed a Syrian leper by the name of Naaman. God cured the outsider, not one of them. You see, these two prophets stepped outside of their community to offer God's grace to those who were not part of that community. The people of Nazareth had heard Jesus' declaration of God's promises, a guarantee, but a guarantee to them only. It was confined to the borders of Israel. It was confined to the walls of that tabernacle, of that synagogue. And it was not meant to be spread away and to given out as far as they were concerned. The good news is Jesus' proclamation was for all people. For all people. He announced the liberation of all people. He expanded the blessings and care of God beyond the synagogue, beyond the borders of Israel. He didn't like that. He didn't like it. And Luke reports, all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up and drove him out of the town and took him to the brow of the hill in which the town was built in order to throw him off a cliff. The problem is really very simple. They were not willing to share God. They were not willing to share God. They were not willing to share His grace and His blessings with anyone. We have to ask ourselves, what does this mean to us? What does the Scripture say to us? I think two things to start with. Actually, there's a lot of things it says to us, but I choose to speak on these two today. And that is, first of all, God's promise of liberation is for all God's people, regardless of race, regardless of nationality, regardless of gender. It's for all people. Everyone. God's grace is never subject to the limitations of boundaries, of nations, of church, or any interest groups. And the second thing is, comes closer home to us. We, as Christ's disciples, are instruments of God's grace. You and I. We are instruments of God's grace for others. We are to show that grace for others. But we are never free to set limits on who may receive that grace. There was once a church in a busy town, and the people in that community came to that church each Sunday, and it was a wonderful group of people. And they would come together each Sunday and address each other and enjoy each other's presence. But one Sunday, the doors of that church opened up, and a middle-aged man came walking in with scraggly hair and a bushy beard, worn-out clothes and shoes 2 sizes too big. And he walks to the end of the aisle and sits down at the first pew on the floor. Everybody is amazed and in awe at what's taking place, and they wonder what's going on. Who is this? Who is coming to our church? Who has invaded our community? And you could hear a pin drop. No one knew what to say. But then an old man in the back of the church gets up and with his cane makes his way down to the front of the church. And everybody thinks, good, somebody's going to do something about this situation. But then all of a sudden, with the aid of his cane, he lowers himself to the floor and sits down by this man. And puts his arm around him. And they look to the preacher to continue the sermon. But the people in the synagogue were not able to expand God's grace outside their community. And you know, it's sad. Because they couldn't. Jesus wasn't able to do anything with them. He said himself, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. They just simply couldn't see past the walls of their synagogue. Putting the scripture together and the sermon together and trying to find ways to make it fit, I kept coming back with a thought that kept hitting me, and this is it. I wonder what more could happen, or what more God could really do if we were to expand the boundaries of our community. I wonder what more He could do if we were to open the limits of love out even more. I just wonder what might happen. And Luke says this: all spoke well of him and God's Son. This is God's Son. And if we aren't willing to share